Hello. In episode 23 of Heirs for Architecture's second season, Fonna Forman and Teddy Cruz speak about their design practice, research and writing, now comprehensively and elegantly presented in two fantastic books, Spatializing Justice, Building Blocks, published in October last year, and Socializing Architecture, Top Down, Bottom Up, published this month, both by MIT Press.
A lot of our work has dealt with researching the bottom-up energies, the kinds of processes that are embedded in migrant neighborhoods as people negotiate their own spaces, as processes of solidarity and localized policy, let's say, the sort of organizational, social, and political practices begin to emerge to resist the imposition of exclusionary economic policies and so on. So in other words, the creative intelligence that is inscribed in these migrant communities, we've been researching, but also mobilizing to allow us to really rethink our own methods, our own procedures. And somehow we feel that this knowledge needs to be represented.
A is for Architecture, a podcast about architecture, buildings, urban culture and space.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Heirs for Architecture. I am honoured today to be talking to two personal heroes of mine, Fonna Forman and Teddy Cruz. Fonna and Teddy, would you introduce yourselves, please?
Yes, I'm Teddy Cruz. I'm a professor of public culture and urbanization in the Visual Arts Department at University of California, San Diego, where I also co-direct the Center on Global Justice with my partner, Fonna Forman. I'm originally from Guatemala in Central America and migrated to the United States in the early 80s. And incrementally, as I arrived to San Diego, California, began to realize that I had landed in one of the most interesting geographies of conflict in the world, really. And incrementally, it began to be the laboratory for a lot of the thinking and practice, really, that we have developed in the last years. Primarily, I think that at some point, the realization of, as architects, we did not necessarily wanted to focus on our practice devoted to, how would I say, designing houses for the wealthy or boutique hotels, but that we really wanted to head on enter into this territory, which in a way for many decades had been the issues embedded in this territory had been so off the radar of schools of architecture and of the profession of architecture itself. So I began to realize how fundamental it was to reorganize my own thinking and my own methodologies and strategies as an architect by deepening the relationship to the specificity of this territory. And incrementally, I think the passions and the kind of dreams of shaping a practice, not only as a way of building something, but as an object, let's say, of architecture, but as a way of building a position to then detonate a very different idea of practice. So the focus became really, generally speaking, we can talk more about it later, I think, really understanding the positive impact of immigrants in the transformation of the American neighborhood. And so from the beginning, I think this idea of focusing on bottom-up informal urbanization in the hands of migrants to reinvent and reimagine the city from below really is ultimately what joined my practice. I think what eventually, that's how Fonna and I really came together, focusing on informal dynamics, let's say, in the city across a variety of registers. So maybe Fonna can introduce herself now. We can touch on other issues later.
Thank you. Yeah, that was amazing. Fonna, follow that.
Follow that. So I'm Fonna Forman. I am a political theorist, a professor of political theory at the University of California, San Diego, where I founded and direct the UCSD Center on Global Justice, which is focused on community-based solutions to poverty and other environmental stressors. And we have increasingly over the years focused on challenges right here in the San Diego-Tijuana border region, which is just a few miles from our campus. I was trained as a political scientist, really as a historian of political ideas, and my work focused on 18th century global development. and I focused a lot on poverty and international response to poverty. And over time, I just became increasingly kind of left feeling dissatisfied by the disengagement of the academy from engaging real world issues like poverty and an environmental crisis. And when the academy conventionally does engage those things, it's from a very rarefied kind of position from above. And the research is often seen as applied, where the researcher descends down into the community, studies it, and ascends back up and publishes papers and books that circles of people in their small universes read. And that model just left me cold. So in the course of my career, I began to think more about how an academic researcher could actually partner with communities that were facing these challenges at the front lines, which completely reorients the idea of academic research from a vertical kind of exercise to a horizontal one, where the community actually begins to co-develop the questions and the answers to these challenges. And so when I set up the Center on Global Justice, we became centrally committed to doing this kind of community engaged research. And it was in this period that a mutual colleague introduced Teddy and me. And while I was working on projects all over Africa and South Asia, Teddy was really focused on the challenges right near our campus at the border. And so we began to join forces, bringing Center on Global Justice and Teddy's history of urban and architectural research at the border together. And that was about 12 years ago. And we've been building and developing our practice and our project together ever since.
There you go. That's Oh, sorry, Teddy, I interrupted.
No, I just was going to say that maybe we should tell the story. I mean, in reality, that mutual friend, actually the cultural coyote who linked us, even though Fonna and I teach in the same university, but we didn't know each other yet.
Didn't know each other.
It was Richard Sennett. It was Richard Sennett. And that was really sweet because he came and together, it was the first time Fonna and myself together, we crossed the border with Richard to go and visit sites and so on. And since then, we became inseparable, Fonna and myself. And so, but I should say, again, this interface between a political theorist and an architect, I think we belong to two different parts of campus of our university that never really speak to each other, right? And so for us, incrementally, it became that beautiful interpenetration, the idea that maybe political scientists could begin thinking spatially about their issues and their research, but also how architects, humanities, artists can begin to think more ethically, more socially, and more politically. I think through political thought and prioritizing, let's say, the kind of crisis as a way of reorganizing our own procedures. So I think we began to exchange different methodologies to approach much of our work. And to tell you the truth, Fonna now, she should get an honorary degree in urbanism and architecture. I mean, and I think that I have begun to learn a lot more about, obviously her own specialization. So yes, I think it has been what I call a wonderful mutual positive contamination.
Yeah. Well, it's a really interesting one, this idea of interdisciplinarity, because what you're saying, Fonna and Teddy, is my experience too, that there's these silos of knowledge, particularly within the academy, but within the profession of architecture, which are incredibly resistant to any form of modification. And even where we do this kind of participatory research, as you said, Fonna, we do it from on high, we do it without question, we do it from a position of, it's not even a position of privilege, it's an assumption of privilege that I find actually quite hair-raising in many situations. But there's this, so like, and then even when we try and do interdisciplinary research, what we all do is we try and make everybody else do what we're doing. So I mean, it sounds like a dumb question. How do you operate? How does a political theorist think spatially? Like, what are the devices? This, I think, is a question that I assumed we would come to later, but I think it's relevant now. And what are the devices for starting to think ethically, given the tools of architecture, given that the mode that we operate through is as it is? How do we think ethically, and how does a political scientist, someone who's involved in the political economy, how do they think spatially? Do you start drawing, Fonna? Did you get a sketchbook and a thick pencil?
I've tried, but I gave up on that. But the truth is, so we've been a little bit critical of the kind of academic mantra of interdisciplinarity.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's been in many ways the reason why our campus has gotten behind our work. So Teddy and I lead a kind of a truly interdisciplinary space within the university that's very agile. Mm-hmm. And able to kind of do its work without being beholden to any disciplinary agenda on the mm-hmm. campus. So that's been very helpful. But we've really, this sort of interdisciplinarity as a kind of, as an aspirational hand-holding exercise, we don't really see it that way. It's the challenges themselves that demand the knowledges that need to be around the table, both the academic and the non-academic knowledges. Mm-hmm. And the real challenge, obviously, we operate in very different merit cultures within the university with different ideas of production value. So, for example, in the social sciences, we are accustomed to seeing ourselves as scientific interpreters of reality, mm-hmm. and what you do with data, measuring and making predictions, and bringing in any sort of qualitative measure or engaging the subject in any sort of way pollutes the purity of the science. Mm-hmm. So the kind of work that I do, the attempt to kind of bring ethics and sort of spatial justice into a scientific activity has been met with skepticism. And I've actually it's been a challenge within the social sciences to get validation for this sort of work. And Teddy too has faced similar kinds of challenges in the spaces that he moves. But at bottom, for us, it's about learning how to communicate beyond disciplinary silos, learning that we're often speaking the same languages, different words to do it. So learning how, and we pass this on to our students as well. All of the research teams that we put into the field are comprised of students from different fields, from the arts and humanities, social sciences, engineering, business, the natural sciences, learning how to communicate with one another across silos, focus together on a challenge. How can we work with this particular community on a particular climate adaptation project? Mm-hmm. And it's amazing how the knowledges begin to how they begin to bridge as they focus on a shared challenge.
Mm-hmm. So one thing that we can say about this is also that has been fundamental to our practice is to take what we call creative detours. I mean, obviously, I operate still based on the centrality of spatial thinking, aesthetics, architecture, the spatialization of time, the temporalization of space, a variety of particular procedures that architects obviously normatively engage. But often it's been necessary to suspend that obsession, let's say, with architecture as just a self-referential, autonomous field, focusing on the design of the object. But instead to really think relationally about how that connects to so many other things. Primarily, the many topics and registers that have been peripheral to the field of design. So in that sense, I remember the words of Geoffrey Capra, who challenged us to rethink what ecology means in our time, that traditionally ecology, let's say the ecology of the bicycle has only talked about the functional relationship of the parts of the bicycle to itself. So again, it's a kind of autonomous self-referential thinking. And instead he says, now we have to ask more questions. Where that bicycle was produced, but what kind of political economy, what kind of labor, where, and what is ultimately its cultural application, because it is different to ride a bicycle in India, China, than California. Mm-hmm. So all I'm saying is that when we speak of interdisciplinarity and we are critical of it, it's exactly what you said. really, Ambrose, at the end of the day, is that here in the universities, just sitting around a round table, where everybody's just saying something from the vantage point of their own silos. But just by being together in the one room, we think that we're being interdisciplinary. Interdisciplinarity, for it to be meaningful, like deep ecology, this is what Geoffrey Cabra said, that we need to deepen the notion of ecology. We need to begin to exchange ways of doing and making and thinking. In other words, can for a moment an architect begin to absorb the procedures of an anthropologist or a sociologist, or why not the methodologies of political theorists, to dig deeper into histories of oppression, into histories, intellectual histories for that matter, of the institutional mechanisms that have produced so much havoc. So in other words, yes, it's about stepping out for a moment in order to contact other modalities of process, it's a procedural issue really at the end of the day.
Fantastic. I mean, so clear, and I'm very grateful for that. Now, we come together today to speak about two books of yours, Spatializing Justice, Building Blocks, published at the end of last year, and Socializing Architecture, published just now by MIT Press, which are amazing books, amazing designerly books, and they're all based around this work that you've been doing I'm assuming within the Center for Global Justice, but also within your broader architectural practice. Is that right? Or is all this work derived from the Center for Global Justice?
We are a university-based practice, in a sense, because part of our effort was to really reorganize internal protocols to the institution here, not only to address research and education that is socially engaged. Basically, we have the Center on Global Justice, which is really our research arm for advancing a variety of areas of research with our partners, our community partners. But also here is where we also have our architectural practice. So a studio, Teddy Cruz and Fonna Forman, architectural practice. So we have found finally, after all these years, a beautiful way of triangulating education, research, and practice inside the same laboratory. And also in that sense, carrying the university as a partner to really invest in the kinds of projects we are advancing. So
Studio Teddy Cruz, I probably came across it 20 years ago, 19, 18 years ago, something like that. It makes me feel terrifically old, much older than I actually feel, weirdly enough. And yet you've been together 13 years. Has there been, so the context that you're working in, and Teddy, you've been working in that at least since then. Fonna, you came to it, I don't know what, 10 years after Teddy had been operating in that area. Obviously, Teddy, I would be very interested to know how you feel your work has been inflected by this, because I can see a consistency in the work over those years, but certainly it's, as you say, it's become much more kind of politically charged. But I suppose to understand it properly, we have to understand the context in which you're talking about, which from the perspective of someone in southeast England, near the richest city in the history of the world, or whatever London is, but at the same time living in an area that is characterized by transient populations, incredible levels of migration these days, deep impoverishment and inequality. We have a kind of sense maybe of what you're dealing with at the Tijuana border, but perhaps you can unpack it a little bit and explain it in detail.
Sure. So we really see our practice as an embedded research-based practice here in the border region between San Diego and Tijuana. So our campus is just a few miles away from this international crisis zone, which allows an amazing proximity between the field and the studio, right? So we've really committed our practice to this region and partnering very closely with communities on both sides of the border. We see this zone, this very local zone for us, as a microcosm of all the injustices and indignities faced by vulnerable people, across the world, political violence, dramatic inequality, accelerating climate impacts and migratory patterns, labor exploitation, border building everywhere. So we think a lot about the correspondence between our local zone and conflict zones across the world, and how we can learn from those zones, bringing best practices into our own region, and how what we're doing here can become models for practices working in conflict zones across the world. I mean, we've worked in other sites, but it always comes back here. We bring lessons that we're learning from urban projects that we've done around the world right back here into our own neighborhood.
You can only imagine how many calls we get often of artists wanting to come and do an installation or a work at the border. And even though we do not have anything negative to say about ephemeral acts of resistance, we have engaged into those acts of performative resistance in the past. We have grown dissatisfied with the idea that often artistic interventions come into a territory and then they pack their bags 2 or 3 days later, and nobody stays around really representing politically and in many other ways those communities that are really suffering in the trenches. So who is going to take care of many of those issues after the happening? This is something that we discussed, Fonna and myself, very much, and we, throughout time, I think we have been committed to this territory in order to deepen again our awareness, but also our relationship with very concrete actors and communities, grassroots organizations that are really at the forefront of challenging and resisting and fighting against those forces of marginalization. So yes, we decided to be a long-term, rooted and very permanent kind of, how would I call it, embedded practice. And obviously it has to do with the research that we have advanced throughout the years. I mean, as Fonna said, this is really our laboratory for tackling many of those vectors of force that Fonna mentioned earlier, those challenges of urbanization. Because when geopolitical forces hit the ground, they are spatialized. In other words, they are spatializing justices. And so that was the generative sort of idea about creating this first book. What might be the 30 most important provocations? Let's say manifesto-like for a moment, even though we are suspicious of manifestos often, but what might be the 30 most important priorities as we challenge really those alienating and forces of marginalization?
Well, I know you're not spending too much time. It's really interesting, and it's really you're explaining it very, very well. I think and I really love this idea of groundedness. So I do work of this kind, and I've been developing since coming to this university. I've been developing some socially engaged practice in an interdisciplinary or transdisciplinary, which I think might be interdisciplinary but with new trousers on or something. Anyway, it's the same sort of thing. And for me, that embeddedness is, to a certain degree, it's just simply good manners. If you go into poor communities to do research or to do practice, and then you wander off as soon as you've achieved it, it's just very inelegant, as my old PhD supervisor, Diana Mitlin, called it. It's just really, really rather gross.
No, it's true. It is gross. And not only that, what it's done is it's built a kind of an suspicion within communities of university researchers and university designers who arrive with good ideas because they disappear. And one of the benefits of doing this long-term local work is that we built trust with communities over time, and we can actually see things happening in these communities as the result of our partnerships. So, this trust breeds great work, and this great work breeds change, and it's a mutually reinforcing kind of process. And yet, this idea that you have to listen and be humble and open, we also come with ideas, right? So it's not that we arrive as sort of empty receptacles waiting to be filled with sort of the community's desires. We all have desires. The community has desires. We're coming with expertise and knowledge. It's about how to weave these things together into a more responsive and effective approach to the challenges these communities are facing. And sometimes that's actually conflictual, right? So sometimes you have to work through the rough bumps of merging ways of thinking and doing. But in a context of trust, you can get through those challenges and come through on the other end. Mm-hmm. So that's what this long-term local work has enabled here in our practice.
So that interdisciplinarity is quite an interesting one, isn't it? That it's the idea of disciplinarity is essentially a top-down idea anyway, because marginalized communities of deep impoverishment probably don't consider themselves as having a discipline to begin with. So you're talking about disciplines plus those other people who we might describe as normal people. And so it becomes even more complicated, that negotiation. And this idea of competing desires, as you put it, how do you measure success in that environment? Like, what does success look like in a Fonna Forman Studio Teddy Cruz project?
Yes, and this maybe helps us to arrive to the main point that at least I wanted to say earlier, because obviously a lot of these issues emerge from the specificity, the political specificity of this geography of conflict. And I was saying that a lot of our work has dealt with researching the bottom-up energies, the kinds of processes that are embedded in migrant neighborhoods as people negotiate their own spaces, as processes of solidarity and localized policy, let's say, the sort of organizational, social, and political practices begin to emerge to resist the imposition of exclusionary economic policies and so on. So in other words, the creative intelligence that is inscribed in these migrant communities, we've been researching, but also mobilizing to allow us to really rethink our own methods, our own procedures. And somehow we feel that this knowledge needs to be represented towards the institutions. So often we say that our practice is very much interested not only on the bottom up, but primarily in the interface between the top down and the bottom up. Somebody has to facilitate how to enable that knowledge from below to trickle upwards in order to knock on the doors of the institutions and infiltrate into those institutions, in fact, to transform top-down policy. So connecting the resources of institutions and redirecting them to support that creative intelligence is really part of this facilitation. So that implies ultimately the co-production of the city with others, right? I think we have been very much inspired by the idea that we in our practice, we're trying to co-produce the city with migrants. Migrants are our partners. And in that sense, one fundamental inspiration for this first book of Spatializing Justice is the notion that urban and social justice is a redistributive system or concept. In other words, the redistribution justice depends on the redistribution, not only of resources to sites of urgency and poverty, but also the redistribution of knowledges. So the co-production of knowledges has been really part of what we are thinking to even expand the notion of interdisciplinarity. It's not only everybody inside the university, but how do we then produce new linkages with grassroots organizations to create circulations of knowledge, and in fact, enable or mobilize the economic power of our public university to become leverage for our grassroots organizations partners to develop their own housing and public space. So something that we can talk later, but it is part of the second book, which is really, the second book is really the actual catalog of projects that are our response to the 30 provocations of the first book. The last chapter is about a major project for us that really linked all the dots, which is the community stations, the cross-border community stations, which are in fact very interesting models of collaborative education with migrant communities, the co-production of knowledge, but also became our main model of shared urban intervention, where the university's programmatic and economic power became leverage for our partners in the communities to be developers of their own housing and their own public space, and we have already achieved. So what success looks like that we have already begun, in fact, finally, after all these years, begin to present a new model of economic and community process that advances communities as stewards of their own neighborhood-based infrastructure. We have built already 2 projects that are really illustrations of that possibility.
Really, it's really wonderful. I love this idea of I'm interested in the idea of co-production, and I suppose I'd like a little bit. It's one of those words that actually has kind of a technical definition, but has become generalized as a kind of notion, hasn't it? But this idea that you used of circulations of knowledges, Teddy, I think is a really elegant way of putting it. That it's not about, it sort of eschews some of that kind of rather abusive practices of participatory action, which have become, I think, speaking personally, I think rather poor. Participation is a device now used more by developers than it is by communities, and that should tell you everything you need to know about it. Because co-production has something else about it. So So I did want to touch on this idea. So the book Socializing Justice, and you've mentioned this a number of times, Teddy, it has these 30 provocations, these 30 prompts to action, and obviously we can't go through all of them. But I thought maybe that we might speak about a few of them. I picked out a few, and I don't know if there's any that specifically that you feel are really useful ways of kind of introducing some of the energy and the dynamic of the book. The first one I picked out was number 6, which is called Visualize Urban Conflict, and I thought that might be a really interesting one to kind of pick apart, particularly because of the context in which you're living. Like, what does that mean? What do we do? How does it operate?
I mean, all of these are so fundamental to our practice. We wanted to produce a monograph in 2 volumes. One, again, these 30 building blocks, which is really the basic, or how would I call it, the framework conceptually, our main tenets, our commitments, really. Yeah. And then the second book really are the projects that follow those commitments. So I was going to say the most important, but at the end of the day, all of them are important. But one of the major ones is the visualization of conflict. Conflict becomes our creative tool. Mm-hmm. Of course, in order to really tackle many of these issues, we need to understand the very conditions that have produced the crisis. Mm-hmm. The knowledges, the institutional mechanisms, the processes that have produced the current crisis. Without understanding the specificity of the conditions that produce the crisis, is very difficult. Yeah. That our interventions are relevant in that sense. And so, yes, conflict becomes our creative tool, and this implies visualizations of those histories of oppression, obviously, in other words, in order to really develop our own economic proformas, let's say, with our partners to co-develop housing and public space, we had to understand in a very specific way, what are the modes of financialization that exist at this moment that only benefit private developers. We needed to understand lending in more specific ways, or subsidy structures. In other words, we need to understand the conditions first in order to then reorganize resources and modes of intervention. And the building block for this particular piece is one that we call 60 linear miles of transborder conflict. In other words, what we have done is that we go through the territory very specifically. We traverse it, sometimes walking, sometimes really moving through, but we understand specific urban borders across those 60 linear miles. We argue every city in the world, if all architects could walk 60 linear miles from, or drive, whatever, from downtown to the periphery, and you will begin to witness the moments of conflict between top-down forces of urbanization colliding with bottom-up social or ecological, dynamics. So to understand those moments of crisis internal to the city. So yes, that's what pertains to this particular building block: the need to visualize conflict as a creative.
That particular building block, this idea of visualizing conflict, makes a lot of sense in the context of where you are, of San Diego and the Tijuana border. I was one of the one of the prompts that I sent to you both before was questioning or asking, really, I suppose, this idea that all of these provocations, and they are very elegant, by the way, and I love a good it's the architect in me that loves a good pithy three-worder, but I like this idea of acting as well. So this is again this leap you're making out of the academy, the seminar room and the tables into the world of action, which I think is demanded at this moment. But I did wonder about this issue that you are, all of them, well, as I read it, all of the provocations seem to be about, in some way, contesting centralized power structures, systemic issues, and promoting a much more, as you say, contextual, much more grounded, much more situated kind of solution. The crises that you're describing seem to me to be crises of modernity. And the systemic problems are modern problems. And I suppose one of the things that attracts me so much to the work that you're doing is the idea that through enabling grassroots communities, we are in a way disassembling those modernist hierarchies, which I think is really good. But at the same time, you don't entirely reject them. You, Teddy, remain an architect. You are both within academic institutions. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that balance. Like, how do we co-produce effectively that balance? How do we, to use your words, how do we generate a meaningful interface between the top down and the bottom up? Where do they meet? Is it just above the grassroots, or does the top down have to step way back and allow the grassroots to percolate up through the institutions?
No, this is very important. To get back to the early part of your question about systems and institutions. Mm-hmm. Many people who focus on the capacities of the bottom up have become very critical of the role of institutions in urban development. We believe in the top-down public, and it needs to be reconstituted to be responsive to public needs. And so this role of urban curator or facilitator between the knowledges, carrying the knowledges and capacities and aspirations of the bottom up to institutions to hold them accountable. We want to help construct accountable public institutions that then reinvest in intelligent ways. You're right, participatory practices have become box-ticking exercises for urban institutions, right? They tick the box and then they ascend back up and do whatever they're going to do. No, we want the top down to be authentically responsive to the needs and aspirations of the bottom up. So from the base of the public university, we're able to open doors that, communities might not otherwise have access to. Now, there's a, notice in the building block that we just discussed, it's not just about urban conflict, but it's about visualizing urban conflict. And that visual component is very important to everything that we've tried to do in these books as well as in our practice. This is about changing societal norms and perceptions about those systems and institutions that govern the way we go on. There's a tendency, particularly in underserved communities, to naturalize and normalize the conditions of injustice, that this is just simply the way of the world. And one of the ways we want to visualize the springs and pulleys of injustice is to help build the capacity for political action within these communities. So, for example, we live very close to the busiest international checkpoint in the Western Hemisphere. And it's not surprising that the quality of life and health of communities that abut that border is dismal. So there are high rates, for example, of lung disease. Residents in these communities have naturalized lung disease and emphysema and so forth. It's just the way of life. This is the way things go on here. No, by visualizing the histories of border building, of the way freeway infrastructure was designed, of the way these neighborhoods were developed, where schools are placed, human beings made those decisions to put your neighborhood in the vortex of these dynamics, right? So human action needs to resist it. So visualizing urban conflict is a way of building capacity in neighborhoods to challenge institutions and systems that are fundamentally unjust.
Yeah. Loud and clear. Teddy, you raised your hand at one point there. Did you
No,
want...
I just wanted to say that at the end, we do believe in institutions. Our project demands institutional accountability. So in a sense, really is about recalibrating the interface, as I was saying earlier, between the top down and the bottom up.
Yeah.
And many in our work, really the grassroots and the bottom up is leading conceptually in terms of ideation. But I think that we cannot just suspend institutional involvement in this case. That's the reason we believe in a new type of, institutional critique project. After all, modernity, as Octavio Paz, the Mexican poet said, is not only about the onward march of industrialization, but it's really about the capacity of institutions for self-critique. And I think that for us, all the crises that we're witnessing at bottom are really a cultural crisis of the institutions. Institutions are unable to reorganize themselves to tackle the crisis. New kind of planetary coordination, all the way to the specificity of local environments to reimagine bioregions like ours, because the border wall at the end is a self-inflicted wound. It's not only about an artifact that separates us from the other, but it's inflicting damage to our own socio-environmental assets that are shared between two communities divided by that wall. In fact, these two communities should be collaborating because their destinies are intertwined. So yes, modernism, for that matter, also is not just an aesthetic project. It's about shaping the institutions that can endorse and support that project, hopefully for social equitable ends. You see what I'm trying to say? So we cannot decouple the kind of overarching, reorganization, again, of resources and knowledges. And in that sense, it's really an institutional project that connects in more effective and just ways with the bottom up. But yes, the top down had its chance and it screwed it up. So yes, through that now we need to let the creative intelligence of the bottom up allow for the reimagining of public and urban policy. That's what it comes on. And who facilitates that? I think architects have a role. As well as political theorists.
Well, I think this is really interesting. So this is something that you touched on earlier, Fonna, is this idea that when we do, authentic community engagement, we go in as empty vessels. Us professionals, we must sort of abandon all our value systems and all our knowledges and all our privilege and all of these things and sort of humble ourselves. And that's not what Eleanor Ostrom means when she talks about co-production. That's not what... That's not going to achieve anything, because as far as I see, they know you're lying and you know you're lying. And when you cycle away on your nice bicycle to your nice part of town, you ignore what they've said because it's unsustainable. So bringing out that I think that's a very elegant idea, that we come with our baggage, but we also come with our proficiencies, and to deny them is disingenuous. And as you said, Fonna, they don't believe you in the end. They distrust the process.
Right. Well, Eleanor Ostrom is one of my intellectual heroes, and I've learned a great deal from her. But right. I mean, as you said, there's an imperative when you first arrive to surrender and listen. I mean, that's just but the longer term relations that we've had have allowed us to be more overt in bringing what we can and navigating tensions and moving forward.
Yeah, we don't have huge amounts of time. I know you've got a hard leave in a matter of minutes, but I wanted to go. The conversation is complicated and it can tend towards the heavy, but I think what is in both books, they are leavened by a sense of creative joy. And I think that's really why the work is so inspiring, because it's not just a tirade, as you say, Teddy. It's not a manifesto. It's about a kind of, it's not that bounded. It's not that controlled, and there's lots of ideas within it. For example, the provocation number 22, transcend hospitality, is actually an incredibly joyful one, and I wanted to. And then you see it unpacked in the example that you gave in Socializing Architecture, the idea of these community stations, which become spaces of cooperation, of mutuality, of understanding, of sharing. And I just wondered whether you could talk a little bit about this idea, this
Sure.
the flip side to the rage, in a way, the flip side to the.
One of the things that we've experienced here living in the border region for so long is that things go on differently here than the official political narratives about the border region, the site of criminality, the site of hostility and conflict. I mean, there is that there, but life also goes on here. And we are actually inspired by the infectious optimism of communities that are struggling against these injustices and resisting and persevering. So again, we learn a lot from that, and part of the joy you might feel in the work really emerges from this incredible inspiration. But we're also witnessing amazing, and again, we're living in a border region that is artificially disrupted by a physical barrier. And one of the things that we witness in our work are these amazing flows and circulations that move back and forth across the wall that really constitute the hybrid identities of people who inhabit this region. And one of the things we like to do in the pedagogic work, within our projects, is to imagine what this region is like without the wall. It's this very speculative, imaginative exercise where people begin to stitch together our hopes and aspirations for this region. It's a really wonderful exercise. Now, on this issue of hospitality, look, we obviously, when the migrant arrives, there are immediate needs of food and shelter, needs of the body. But as time goes on, hospitality is not the proper. It's a charitable concept. It's a wonderful ethical concept, but it's not a model for an inclusive society. How do we think about long-term inclusion of migrants who are arriving in increasing numbers over time? And again, how do we think about this in a regional way without the border wall there to obstruct our thinking? So thinking beyond hospitality means reimagining ourselves alongside the migrant. There is, with accelerating climate change and all of the stressors in Central America right now, migration is accelerating. We're just at the tip of it, right? We don't typically think of this region as a site of climate migration, but that's what it is. These people are arriving here because of agricultural failure. We need to be reimagining this region in light of these inevitable geopolitical forces that are going to change our demographics here. So yes, we're hopeful. We're hopeful about what this region might become in the next period. And it's our community partners that actually give us that buoyancy in the face of so much, so many reasons not to be hopeful.
Beautiful. I mean, can I ask one more question? Okay, this is the last question, I promise you, and it's to do with the nature of the books themselves, which are beautiful and visually stimulating, full of wonderful images. The second book, dare I say, even more than the first book, although the first book is full of these wonderful diagrams as well. And it brings, as a designer myself, I wonder what you see in these. Could you sort of unpack a little bit what drawing and designing does? Like, what is the role of design here, particularly perhaps for you, Fonna? How do you see design as leavening your practice?
Well, it's been a challenge for me because social scientists typically communicate in very sterile narrative prose. And I became increasingly interested in communicating to broader audiences beyond academic audiences. And the visualization, the diagramming of complex data has become a resource for us in mobilizing community sort of participation. And so, we see these books as communicating to many different kinds of audiences, academic audiences, yes, architectural audiences, to students, but also to communities and community agencies that are eager to move the needle on the ground. The way we see the relation between the books is, the first book, Spatializing Justice, we really wanted to capture the sort of theoretical substrate of our practice and of our work. And we wanted these provocations to stand alone as a kind of manifesto-like document to sort of mark where we are as a practice, really in the early decades of the 21st century. And then the second book is the monograph, really, that we've been wanting to publish for the last decade, where we're really documenting our projects, both theoretically, the theoretical sort of foundations of the work, the descriptions of the work, but also a visual a visual diary of the projects themselves and their evolution. And you'll see that the images combine, conventional architectural, drawings and photography, but also a lot focused on process and the community process of designing and developing and collectively funding and at the end managing and programming these spaces over time. So the books really are a unified whole, separated under two covers.
Yes, one thing that is essential, maybe I can say, in the relationship between Fonna and myself in terms of exchanging approaches to this, is really bringing back the operative nature of diagrammatics, in a sense, to think conceptually about procedures as opposed to things. But in essence, at the end of the day, yes, we have enjoyed throughout time, in terms of the debate in architecture, by the way, about drawings versus diagrams. I mean, drawings ultimately describe the reality, but what is interesting about diagrams is that diagrams, in fact, perform the information they contain. So for us, I think we have returned to drawing as a performative, also operative system that allows us to really detonate a process. In the second book, obviously, there is a variety of diagrams and drawings. In fact, some of those drawings, by the way, Ambrose, are co-produced with our community partners. So we believe in drawings also, obviously, as political tools to reorganize a conversation, particularly between community activists, politicians, and ourselves.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. That was really very wonderful.
Thank you. Thank you, Ambrose.
Thank you.
And so it goes. An honour really to speak with such engaged and prolific folk, so thanks to Fonna and Teddy for that. Please see the podcast description for links to the 2 books on the MIT Press website, where you can buy them, and also to Fonna and Teddy's professional profiles and websites, including their practice website. Thanks to MIT Press for the hard copy and for the PDF of the books. Do please share this episode far and wide, of course. And thanks for listening. Cheers.